Good afternoon and welcome to Fridays at 1. Thank you very much for joining us. Fridays at 1 is sponsored by the Lifelong Peer Learning Program, LP Squared, at the CUNY Graduate Center. I'm Ellen Sills-Levy. I'm one of approximately 300 members of LP Squared, and I also co-chair the committee that plans our Fridays at 1 speaker programs. The CUNY Graduate Center is a postgraduate degree conferring institute within the City University of New York system. Our campus is located in Midtown Manhattan. LP Squared is a non-degree program of the Graduate Center and a vibrant peer learning community of adult learners. Admitted members teach and learn from each other in addition to organizing activities and special events. If you are retired or semi-retired and would like to learn more, please visit www.lp2nyc.org. Click Join Us and submit your contact details to receive more information. We offer Fridays at 1, our speakers program, about 6 times during the academic year. These are public programs open at no cost to the CUNY community and to the general public too. These programs are funded by LP Square members' donations to the IER, the Institute for Education in Retirement, the nonprofit arm of LP Square. This is one way that LP Square gives back to our community. We invite well-known figures in the arts, sciences, and public affairs for conversations with one of our members, followed by questions from the audience and answers. I now have the pleasure of introducing Michael Shapiro, a fellow member of LP Square. Michael will be welcoming and interviewing today's guest, Beverly Gage, professor of history at Yale University and author of G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. Michael has led many study groups on biographies of political leaders, including LBJ, JFK, Truman, Huey Long, and most recently, J. Edgar Hoover, using Professor Gage's book as the primary resource. Without further ado, I'm passing the virtual mic to Michael.
Thank you, Ellen. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Beverly Gage to Fridays at 1. As Ellen mentioned, Professor Gage's book, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century, received the 2023 Pulitzer Prize for biography, and also the Bancroft Prize in American History and the National Book Critics Circle Award for biography. The Pulitzer Committee, which hailed the book as a monumental work, said that G-Man places Hoover back where he once stood in American political history, not at the fringes, but at the center, and uses his story to explain the trajectories of governance, policing, race, ideology, political culture, and federal power as they evolved over the course of the 20th century. From almost half a century, J. Edgar Hoover led the FBI, transforming it from a law enforcement backwater riddled with scandal into a modern machine that in today's political world is under renewed focus. The decades-long story of its rise under Hoover has been as epic as it has been controversial. Beverly Gage is the John Lewis Gaddis Professor of History at Yale University, and also the author of The Day Wall Street Exploded, a story of America in its first age of terror. She is currently writing a book entitled Where We Are, A Road Trip Through U.S. History, a journey through the American past to mark the nation's 250th birthday in 2026, as well as a biography of Ronald Reagan. Welcome, Professor Gage.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks for that kind introduction, Michael.
Thank you for joining us. So how did your interest in writing a biography of Hoover emerge?
As you mentioned, I written a book before this one called The Day Wall Street Exploded, and that was a very New York book. It looked at a terrorist attack on Wall Street in 1920 that killed several dozen people, shut down the financial markets, but had been kind of lost to American history. Lots of people, especially outside of New York, didn't know much about it. And in the course of doing that research, I came across Hoover as a very young man. Of course, I knew him, as many people know him, as this kind of, fearsome, jowly, figure with lots of power and lots of controversy attached to him. But I got interested because there I was with him he was 25 years old. I was actually about 25 years old when I was doing this. And I started thinking about the trajectory of his life. He was investigating that bombing. He was already starting to think about communism and anti-communism. And I thought there was a big story to tell about him that was really about American politics more broadly.
And what is the place of biography in historical writing?
That's a great question. So, this is something historians talk about and debate quite a lot and have lots of opinions about. My own view of biography is that I think it's a really useful genre because it's a very human genre, right? People can look at the life of an individual and through the life of that individual find out all sorts of things about history that they didn't already know. So I am drawn to biography for that reason. A little bit less because I was so enamored of J. Edgar Hoover as a person, but more because he just seemed a very powerful vehicle for telling this big story about America itself.
So we have a lot of ground to cover because Hoover was the director of the FBI for 48 years, covering 1924 until his death in 1972 at age 77. But we will try. I mean, this goes from Presidents Coolidge to Nixon. So can you tell us about his early life and how it impacted his personality and development?
Hoover is an almost pure creature of Washington, D.C. He was born there in 1895. He never lived anywhere else, and he died there in 1972. His whole career as an adult was within the Justice Department. But I think his Washington roots in an earlier period are really important as well in two particular ways. One is that Washington in the late 19th century was very little like the Washington of today. It was a small backwater, essentially a little southern city that happened to have the federal government in the middle of it. But as a result, Hoover, as a Washington resident, grew up in a world of government service. A lot of his family and a lot of the people in the neighborhood where he grew up were very early civil servants in the federal government before that was much of a big thing. And so he was sort of imbued with that ethic from the very beginning. And then Washington was also a very conservative, segregated Southern city during these years. And so I think a lot of his ideas about race in particular came out of this upbringing in what was essentially the American South.
And from his personal family, his father was quite depressed and had serious depression periods. And in fact, the family lost a sister before Hoover was born 18 months earlier. Did that have some effect on his personality?
Hoover, when he was this famous figure in the 40s, 50s, 60s, when he talked about his childhood, he always talked about this idyllic time, right? When things were simpler, the way basically everybody always talks about their childhood. But when I got to doing the research, it really seemed like a much more complicated and painful story. As you said, his older sister died as a toddler just a few years before Hoover was born. So he never knew her, but he was in some sense sort of the replacement child in a traumatized family, a family that had just lost a young child. When he was 10 years old, his aunt was murdered. This is his mother's brother's wife, in a very scandalous murder-suicide, in which she was killed by the man she was having an affair with, splashed all over the newspapers of Washington, D.C. That was something that actually nobody had ever known before, and that I was able to find. And then, as you say, his own father really was a deeply troubled man. He had a pretty middling job in the government, and he managed to hold on to that for a lot of his adult life. But he was depressed. He was mentally ill in ways that are a little hard to tell from this vantage point. He spent time in a sanitarium. And when he died, when Hoover was a young man, graduated from high school, but still pretty young, his death certificate says that he died of melancholia, which to us is depression. So really quite a painful, dramatic story that Hoover never spoke about publicly.
So Hoover, at a young age, started George Washington. I guess he didn't have requirements before, right into law school. And he joined fraternity Kappa Alpha. And what do we know about Kappa Alpha and how long that associated with Hoover?
That was one of the most fascinating areas of research for me. The fact that Hoover had been in this fraternity and that many members of the early generation of FBI leaders came out of this fraternity was pretty well known. And so my question was, well, what is Kappa Alpha? What did they believe? What was it like? And when I began to investigate that, it turned out it was quite a story. Kappa Alpha was an explicitly Southern segregationist fraternity that had been founded in 1865, right in the aftermath of the Civil War, to carry on the traditions of Robert E. Lee and the lost cause of the white South. And by the time Hoover joined it in 1913, it was very well known as a power center for Southern Democrats, Southern segregationists, and some of the most powerful segregationist voices in the country were Kappa Alphas. One example is a guy named Thomas Dixon, who was a novelist. Thomas Dixon wrote the book called The Klansman that became the basis for The Birth of a Nation, the famous film glorifying the Ku Klux Klan that came out when Hoover was in college and he was a Kappa Alpha.
And eventually Hoover hired many graduates of GW and the Kappa Alpha fraternity, correct?
Right. When Hoover became head of the Bureau, one of the first things that he did was try to hire men who shared his same values. And so he went both to GW, a lot of recruits from there. That is actually still the case. A lot of GW, there's a real GW FBI relationship even today. And then he went to Kappa Alpha and like-minded fraternities to bring that new generation of agents into the Bureau.
So when did Hoover join the Justice Department and what skills did he develop there?
Hoover's first job in the federal government was at the Library of Congress, and he worked there while he went to law school from 1913 to 1917. At the time, GW was a night school for lawyers and other budding professionals. So he worked at the Library of Congress during the day and then went to law school at night. And I think that the Library of Congress was really important in doing what it was just figuring out to do at that point, which was how to keep files, how to manage large amounts of information. And so in 1917, when Hoover graduated from law school, he happened to be graduating into the spring of 1917 as the United States was entering World War I. And that meant that a lot of his friends were going off to serve in the military, but he himself went straight into the Department of Justice, where there were all sorts of new duties that were just coming into being. Some of that was really draconian enforcement of new speech laws that had come about and that are, I think, once again today, a point of reference for many people. The speech laws of World War I, when really thousands of leftists were charged and put in jail. There was draft enforcement, which was a pretty new thing in the United States. And Hoover's first job at the Justice Department was helping to run the German internment program, as well as German registration. So we don't know as much about it today as most people know about Japanese internment, and it was a much smaller scale thing. But about 10,000 German nationals were interned during World War I, and that was J. Edgar Hoover's first job in the Justice Department. And I think that what's interesting about that period and those very early years, he's not powerful. He's just an entry-level lawyer, an employee, but he happened to enter the government just at the moment that these forms of internment, of political repression, of expansions of federal power are just coming into being. And so he's just really there on the ground floor. And he's one of the first people who sort of figures out how to do all of this.
So in 1918, Congress passed an immigration law allowing for deportation of non-citizens. And there is a story about Emma Goldman and others. So how did Hoover participate in that event?
One of the things that comes out of the war, as you say, is a lot of strategizing about who ought to be in the United States and who the United States has the right to get rid of. This was the period of mass European immigration before the war, and a lot of the concerns were about people from other countries who were not citizens of the United States who had political opinions that the US government did not like. And anarchists, Emma Goldman was an anarchist, were among those suspect categories. So during the war, it was made possible not only that if you were an anarchist, you weren't supposed to come into the United States, that had been on the books for a while, but that if you are here and found to be espousing anarchist ideas, you in fact can be deported. Emma Goldman had been jailed during the war for other reasons, for speaking out against the draft and the war effort. But as her prison sentence was coming to an end, Hoover, among others, thought, oh, well, now, right, here's our chance to take her and remove her from the country. And in fact, she and her very close ally, Alexander Berkman, and about 247 other people were deported in a mass deportation from New York Harbor in 1919, simply because of their political opinions.
And if I remember in your book, Hoover actually went to New York to witness the deportation of Emma Goldman. I thought that was sort of surprising.
He did, and they have, according to both of them, a little confrontation as Emma Goldman is boarding first the tugboat to take them out to this big US warship that is sitting out there in New York Harbor. And so they have a little direct back and forth. They had, of course, seen each other in deportation hearings many times at that point. And that whole boatload of people ended up in Bolshevik Russia. They were deported to revolutionary Russia.
Well, that leads me to the question about the so-called Bolshevik menace. Did Hoover believe that was a real threat to American democracy?
This was in many ways really the cause of his life. The thing that he cared most about, besides the FBI itself, was the cause of anti-communism. And I think one of the things that was really interesting for me was that you could see that developing from the very moment he enters the Justice Department. He went into the Justice Department in 1917. The Bolshevik Revolution was in 1917. When he was 24 years old, he became the author of the first official federal briefs describing the new communist parties in the United States. And so he's really wedded to this issue from very, very early on. It's the thing that he cares about. And I think that he was a true believer. I don't have any reason to think that he was especially cynical about this. Now, sometimes this language and this politics got used in deeply cynical ways, but I think that Hoover thought that he was on the side of good and righteousness.
So, as he started to hire people in the FBI, what traits did he look for?
He became director of the Bureau in 1924, so he was just 29 years old. And the Bureau had had lots of controversies about corruption and political repression and all of these things violating people's civil liberties. And so when he came in 1924, he really came in as a reformer, even though he had been involved in a lot of those activities. That was how he presented himself, a clean-cut, young, professional lawyer who was going to clean up this backwater bureau and make it, a shining example of what professional government service looked like. And so part of what he wanted to do was to find men who were going to be on board with that program. And so he fired a bunch of people. And then, as we were saying, when we talked about his fraternity, he went out looking for men who were a whole lot like him. So first of all, they were white. They were conservative. He had a particular fondness for fraternity men and football players, men who were athletic and manly, as he described them. And in fact, if you look at those early personnel sheets, they had a whole checklist of things that they were looking for, many of which had nothing to do with your background, though he liked college graduates and lawyers and accountants. But many of them were, is he tall? Does he have a firm handshake? Can he look you in the eye and convince you? And so that was Hoover's preferred form of agent. And it's one of the reasons that when people think about FBI agents, even today, that tends to be the type, right? The tall white guy in a suit, spit-shined shoes, at the time, hat, always the hat. And that really comes out of Hoover's early vision.
And the FBI was not subject to civil service requirements. That's something that we know going along. So that allowed Hoover to pick and choose.
He was very smart about that. It was really sort of an accident of the way the Bureau was created, which was just sort of an act of fiat within the Justice Department. The Bureau has no congressional charter even today. It was not created through legislation. It was really just created because the Justice Department was tired of borrowing Secret Service agents from the Treasury Department when it wanted to do its own investigations. And so it was a very strange origin, but partly as a result of that, by the time Hoover became head of the Bureau, it was not in the civil service. And so it meant that he could keep an incredible level of control over who was hired, who was fired, what was done to them. And in fact, there were many moments in his career when Congress or the public or the press is pressuring the government to put FBI agents inside the civil service, and Hoover fights that, and he wins, as he often did in these kinds of fights.
We're going to talk about Hoover's social life as we go along, and eventually Clyde Tolson. But there was a fellow by the name of Frank Purvis that I think you discovered some information about him in your research.
Right. His name was Melvin Purvis, and he was an early agent at the FBI. He became actually quite famous in the mid 1930s as the head of the Chicago office, which was the office that gunned down John Dillinger in the middle of the day in a Chicago street. So he went on to become very famous, after which Hoover fired him because he didn't like that rivalry. But what's really interesting about Purvis is that he and his family preserved this very, very intimate set of letters with Hoover beginning in the late 1920s and moving through the 1930s, before Hoover was famous, before Purvis was famous. And so it's one of the few places that you can sort of see what Hoover was like interpersonally as a young man. They're actually pretty flirtatious and homoerotic letters. They read a little bit like a boss slightly sexually harassing his subordinate. So these are all, of course, our categories. They weren't the categories they were working with them, but they're really a fascinating and an intimate set of exchanges that were really valuable to me.
And just to get to the point later on, what happened to Melvin Purvis and how did Hoover respond to that?
Melvin Purvis, as I said, became famous and then got fired very quickly in the mid 1930s. And though they had been really incredibly close in an earlier period, Hoover cut him off altogether. And in fact, spent a lot of time trying to prevent Purvis from having a flourishing life and a flourishing career, even outside the Bureau. So Purvis went on to get married and have kids, but in the early 1960s, he committed suicide, and Hoover refused to acknowledge this. He refused to let the Bureau send a note of condolence to the family, and he remained very, very firmly opposed to any contact with Purvis.
So eventually, all along, Clyde Tolson, I guess you can tell us when Clyde Tolson came along and how does he fit into the picture, and tell us about Hoover and Tolson and their social life together.
Tolson, when he started at the Bureau in the 1920s, was just a very typical J. Edgar Hoover recruit. He had gone to GW, he had worked in the government, he was a lawyer, and he had belonged to a fraternity. Tall, good-looking, blonde man. I mean, all of the things that Hoover wanted in an agent, sort of his ideal type. But very quickly, their relationship became the most important relationship of Hoover's life. First, Tolson rose very, very fast through the Bureau to become Hoover's number two there. And that was the case from the 1930s all the way up to the 1970s. But as importantly, they really served as each other's social partners in the world. Neither one of them ever married. Neither one of them ever credibly dated women, as far as I can tell. And they were each other's partners. We don't know, if this progressed into a sexual relationship. It may have, it may not have. This is very hard to determine. But it was certainly an intimate relationship. And in the 1930s, it was a pretty open relationship as well. They were spending all night, out with Walter Winchell in New York, clubbing. The gossip pages are writing about the two of them kind of going around town. They vacationed together, they traveled together. And this continued through the end of their lives. Every year they went off to California for a month together and stayed in the same cabana. They took vacations all over the place. And what was most interesting to me, actually, was that in all of these places, California, Washington, New York, they were a pretty accepted social couple. So if you were going to invite J. Edgar Hoover to dinner, you were going to invite Clyde. You can see them effectively double dating with all of these big figures. Dick and Pat Nixon were great friends of theirs from pretty early on, and they just had this kind of couple relationship. And so this was a a closeted relationship in the sense that it was rarely articulated that this was a romantic or sexual relationship, but it was a very widely accepted social and professional relationship, such that they were, not hiding any of that. They were very openly traveling and not living together, but
Yes,
everything.
and from the pictures that I've seen, it seems like when Hoover was testifying in any situation, when he was going before any other committee, that Tolson was right at his side, standing right next to him, almost that Hoover was not comfortable unless Clyde was there.
They were together almost all the time. I mean, the phrase for that in news coverage was usually that he was Hoover's right-hand man. And in fact, he was often standing, one step behind and to the right of Hoover. So literally his right-hand man.
So I got a kick out of this story, the story about Alvin Karpis and maybe Hoover's sole arrest.
One of the really funny things about J. Edgar Hoover is that though he became the nation's top cop and the most famous law enforcement figure in the United States, he was really just a bureaucrat. He was never an on-the-ground beat police officer or even an investigative agent. So he was a desk man. He was about the bureaucracy, and that's where his skill set was and how he made his career. But in the 1930s, as he was becoming famous and as the FBI was really just starting to get into all of these exchanges with gangsters and becoming this kind of swashbuckling famous force, a congressman, or I guess it was a senator, noted in a hearing that Hoover himself never appeared to have ever made an arrest. And Hoover was furious about this. He was defensive about it. He thought his manhood had been challenged. And so this incident that you talk about is directly in response to that. Famous gangster Alvin Karpis is being arrested. If I remember correctly, it was in New Orleans. Uh,
Yes.
and and so they orchestrate the whole arrest, and then Hoover himself is brought in to kind of finally make the whole arrest. And if I'm also remembering that correctly, they forgot handcuffs, and so they had to tie his hands with a tie. That might be a different story, but there are a few of those in that moment because for about 2 years, Hoover traipsed around the country making very high-profile arrests, and then he never did that again.
So there's another, I thought, an amazing story, and that is about a German U-boat, and now we're already getting almost to 1940, 1942, when a German U-boat sent some saboteurs, and of all places, Amagansett, Long Island. So can you tell us about that incident?
It is a wild story from 1942, so just after the United States entered the Second World War. The FBI had just been charged with doing espionage, counter-espionage, counter-sabotage work, domestic political intelligence, which honestly they didn't know how to do when they were charged with doing it. So they were still kind of figuring it out in this moment. But in fact, the Nazi government loaded up 2 U-boats, submarines, with operatives, most of whom had been Germans who lived in the United States, spoke English, knew how to assimilate, and sent them over here to start going around and committing acts of sabotage. One of those U-boats pulled up, as you said, in Amagansett. The other one was on the coast of Florida. And these 8 guys get out and they're charged with, blowing up bridges and factories and department stores. To some degree, there seemed to have been a sort of anti-Semitic agenda to go after major Jews in the United States. But they didn't appear to be very enthusiastic saboteurs. And in fact, several of them appear to have used this assignment, in fact, to get out of Nazi Germany and to get back to the United States. And so very quickly, one of them calls the FBI and says, hey, there's this thing going on, and it's such a crazy story that he almost isn't believed. But in fact, the FBI investigates. It ends up rounding up all of the saboteurs, and they are tried in a very swift, secret military tribunal. And 6 of them end up executed. The ones who cooperated with the FBI spent a while in prison, but were not killed. And it was both a very dramatic story in its moment and a very strange story because so much of it was secret and then only revealed after the war.
Yeah, parenthetically, this was involved the question whether these men should be tried by a civilian court or a military commission, similar to we have at Guantanamo and on all those issues. And I guess it was, as surprising that within 2 months, the Supreme Court did deal with this, said that the military commission was appropriate, and within 2 months, 6 of the 8 people were executed.
Yeah, it happened very quickly. The Supreme Court actually, if you also kind of look at the archives, their conversations are very interesting. It did become a big case after 9/11 when Guantanamo and other questions of this sort, legal questions of this sort, were being sorted out. Actually, the most chilling piece of that story that to me was not only that it happened really swiftly, but that the men were executed one by one in the same electric chair in alphabetical order, which somehow the kind of bureaucratic nature of that was really striking and a little chilling to me.
Now, moving on from that, you write that there were 20,000 informants in defense plant protection, and that American Legion members agreed to report allegations of disloyalty among friends and neighbors. That sounded quite un-American to me and quite surprising.
We tend to think that the un-American piece of the story comes after the war, as the Red Scare picks up and that language comes to be so prominent. But it's really World War II when the FBI as an organization and as a surveillance force goes through its big expansion. So over the course of the war, the size of the Bureau quadrupled, and they got a whole host of new duties in surveillance and espionage and all of these sorts of things. So that took many, many forms, some of which is what we think about traditionally as surveillance, lots of wiretaps and bugs and tracking people who they thought were suspicious or dangerous during the war. But they also had these very elaborate informant programs that were usually either planting informants in factories or in suspect organizations, or recruiting people who were already in those places to inform for the FBI. And then they built this very, very tight relationship with the American Legion, and that continued long after the war. The American Legion had one of the top officials of the FBI at what it called its Americanization or Americanism Commission. And they did lots and lots of work giving speeches glorifying the FBI, fighting communism. It was a very intensive thing. There's one famous quote in which the annual American Legion convention is described just as an FBI production.
So during this period, FDR was very comfortable with Hoover doing whatever he needed to do to get information, illegal means and so forth. Then Harry Truman becomes the president, and how did that impact the FBI?
Hoover and Roosevelt, as you said, were reasonably close. Hoover was pretty young at that point. FDR liked the FBI. He gave the FBI most of its modern powers, and he didn't think that that was so different from all the other government expansions that were going on. When Harry Truman became president, he was much more suspicious of the Bureau. He privately referred to it as America's Gestapo, and he did not want to keep expanding Hoover's power. The most dramatic moment in all of that was that when the war came to an end, there were all these questions about what the peacetime intelligence system was going to look like. And Hoover had made a bid to become not only domestic intelligence force, but a global intelligence force. And Truman shuts him down and creates the CIA instead so that they would be separate enterprises. And Hoover, of course, never forgave him for that.
Yes, Hoover was very resentful of that. Shortly thereafter, there was this so-called Venona program, which resulted in actually finding out that Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were involved in trading secrets to the Soviet Union. We all know what happened with them and their execution, but what was Hoover's thinking about those two people?
Venona was a set of cables that had been intercepted during the war, going back and forth to the Soviet Union. Now, of course, during the war, ostensibly the US and the Soviet Union are actually allies, but nonetheless, everybody's spying on each other, and the US intercepted these cables. They didn't get translated or decrypted really until after the war, and then very slowly and very piecemeal, and in a very partial way. But they discovered by the late 40s that, first of all, these were not trade cables or military cables. They were talking about intelligence and espionage. And then as the decryptions went on, they began to be able to identify some of the people who were involved. So it is the Venona cables that led the FBI to Julius Rosenberg and Ethel Rosenberg. But one of the things that is, I think, really important about the Rosenberg case is that the FBI was very determined to protect what they knew from Venona. So particularly about Julius Rosenberg, if you look at those cables, there is no question that he is committing espionage. He's working for the Soviet Union. He's trying to get atomic information. But they didn't want to reveal that. And so a lot of the drama of the Rosenberg case, which is about Julius's brother-in-law and his accusations and who's telling the truth and all of this, a lot of the confusion and controversy around it was because they wanted to protect this secret information. So Hoover was very determined to get Julius Rosenberg. The FBI arrested Ethel Rosenberg as well as a point of leverage to try to get Julius Rosenberg to talk. Because what their hope was that they could just kind of continue rounding people up and gathering knowledge and all of this. But both Julius and Ethel refused to talk. And so that, again, precipitated this big crisis, ultimately their execution. Interestingly, Hoover actually argued that Ethel Rosenberg should not be executed because she was the mother of two young children. He obviously did not succeed in that recommendation, but that was his view of the situation.
Wasn't he also hopeful that they could somehow be repatriated to the Soviet Union?
I don't recall that in the Rosenberg case. I mean, it was something that was happening in many other cases. I mean, the Rosenbergs were US citizens, so I don't know. So that doesn't ring a bell, but yeah.
I think I read that in your book. All that I know is right from your book.
Yeah, no, I may have, I
Yeah,
wrote
you
that
may have
book
said
3 years
that.
ago, so it may be. I guess it is true that they were concerned. So one of the things, maybe this is what I was writing about, one of the things that happened in certain other spy cases is that, in fact, the Soviets came in and took their people. So it wasn't a matter exactly of repatriation, but that the Soviets would come in. This ended up happening with Kim Philby and other famous spies. So that's probably what I was thinking about.
So now we get to JFK, and Hoover went to JFK's father, Joe Kennedy, and told him about Kennedy's sexual affair with Inga Arvad, a suspected Nazi spy. And of course, that didn't stop, that ended that relationship, but it didn't stop JFK from continuing to have affairs. And when JFK became president, I think that he knew he had to continue with Hoover as director because Hoover had so much of this information. And actually, when I tell people that I was going to do this course on Hoover, their reaction immediately was, oh, yes, Hoover had that black book on everybody. And so is that really in actuality? Was that a figment of people's imagination? What about the so-called black book?
Well, there was, to my knowledge, no actual physical thing that is, as you might describe. The Bureau gathered lots and lots of information on almost every public figure in the United States. That included presidents, that included congressmen, members of the press, Hollywood stars, you name it, university professors. Some of that they went out and got deliberately. Others, people wrote into them saying, I was out at this party and I saw Congressman X, drunk out of his mind and doing this. And the FBI would take that information and file it away. So they had lots of information about lots of people. Sometimes they were seeking it, sometimes it came to them. And Hoover certainly used that information when he needed to. Sometimes that was in the form of just sending an agent to a congressman's office and saying, Congressman so-and-so, we just want to let you know that we've had this terrible report about you being drunk out of your mind. And, and we want you to know your secret's safe with us, right? So it is that blackmail? I don't know. But Congress was very pliant. I think the other thing that's quite interesting about it is that as long as people think that you have the goods on them, it doesn't really matter if you do or not, because they're going to behave the same way. And so I think at least some of Hoover's power came from precisely the story that you described, the perception that this was there, that they knew everything, everybody's secrets were being held by the FBI, which was only partly true.
So now we come to Martin Luther King, and Hoover, of course, thought that King was an absolute threat to the American democracy. Um, and they found out about Stanley Levinson, who was in the Communist Party, and they wanted Martin Luther King to get rid of him. And Robert Kennedy was authorizing wiretaps of King's home and office. At this time, King hadn't committed any crime. And tell us what those wiretaps and microphones brought about and what happened thereafter.
The King investigation goes on for years and years, is very labor intensive. Lots of FBI energy goes into it, and all without any suggestion that this is any sort of criminal investigation. This is just political and intelligence surveillance. So as you say, it started out because the FBI was concerned about a couple of people in King's inner orbit. Stanley Levinson was one of them, that who had histories within the Communist Party. But it expanded very quickly from there, such that by 1963, in the aftermath of the March on Washington, Robert Kennedy, who was then the Attorney General, authorized wiretaps on King's home, on his office phones. And from there, the FBI was able to track King's travels. That's mostly what he was doing, was traveling around the country, speaking and organizing. And so at that point, they began to bug his hotel rooms. Wiretaps are on phones, bugs are microphones in a room picking up conversation. So once they began to bug his hotel rooms, they then found out a whole lot of information about King's personal life and his sex life. And King does appear to have had many, many sexual partners in many, many different cities. And the FBI picked up on that, thought this was the thing that was going to bring down Martin Luther King, peddled that to the press, mostly unsuccessfully, but in the end, sent a reel of those tapes as well as an anonymous threatening letter to King and his wife, Coretta. They interpreted it as an attempt by the FBI to get King to commit suicide, a really dramatic and frankly terrifying act of political coercion and intimidation. I will say that in this moment, one of the things that is possibly about to happen is that those recordings and transcripts, along with certain parts of the assassination investigation, I think those are about to come out publicly. They've been under court embargo. That was supposed to last until 2027, but the Trump administration is petitioning to have all of that released early. I wouldn't be surprised if it comes out in the next month or two, and it will be interesting to see what's in there and what the political consequences of that are.
And Trump, I think, will take particular pleasure out of releasing those tapes and causing anguish to the King family, so forth. Well, I think that motion is filed with the court, hasn't been determined yet. But in any event, shortly, 2027, when the 50 years expire, that information will become public. I guess I'd like to go now to the break-in at the FBI's office in Media, Pennsylvania. Why was that significant?
That was a very big deal. That's my hometown, but I didn't know this story until I started doing the investigation into the book. For all of Hoover's career, he was deeply committed to keeping FBI files secret. And because of the way that things developed and the Bureau's sort of strange origins, during most of his career, there was no one in the public or in the American government who had an affirmative right to see FBI files. Not the Attorney General, not the President, not the press, not the public, just J. Edgar Hoover. So in 1971, a group of anti-war activists in the Philadelphia area decided that they were going to kind of take that into their own hands. And so they broke into a pretty small regional FBI office and they stole all the files. They stole every piece of paper out of the FBI office and then began releasing these materials to the press. So that is the first moment that it was really proven what a lot of people understood, which is that the FBI was infiltrating and surveilling student activists, the anti-war movement, Black activists, right? All of these things that we know so well today. And the kind of great piece about that story is that they were never caught. So they got away with it. And went on to have, illustrious careers as university professors and nursery school teachers and all of that. About 10 years ago, they finally went public. There's a great documentary about this and a great book about it, too.
So we are compressing 50 years. It's hard to cover everything, but finally, Nixon, I think, maybe because of this, these disclosures, decides that maybe Hoover should retire. And if I remember correctly, Nixon was going to go and ask him to retire, but didn't have the wherewithal to do it.
Yeah, I love that story. Nixon and Hoover were very close from the late 40s onward. They were close personal friends. They were political allies. But when Nixon became president, Hoover's getting quite old at that point. He's in his mid to late 70s while Nixon's president. And there are a lot of people who are criticizing Hoover. There are a lot of people who think he's starting to slow down. He's refusing to do some things that Nixon wants him to do. And so the Nixon staff, they're like, Mr. President, you've got to get him to step down. And so they write these memos strategizing about this. My favorite strategy of theirs was like, just make him a Supreme Court justice and he'll step down. Glad that didn't happen. But in any case, Nixon takes his talking points and he sits down for breakfast with J. Edgar Hoover. And he suggests that, it might be time for Hoover to step down. And Hoover says, no, I don't want to do that. And Nixon says, oh, okay. And then by the time Nixon leaves that meeting, he's agreed to expand the FBI.
So now, as a result of all this, we have a 10-year term for the FBI director, but of course we just know that Trump convinced Christopher Wray to retire only after 7 years. So I guess that doesn't always hold. How was Hoover? Hoover now dies by himself shortly thereafter. And how was he honored at his death? I think that's an indication of what the public thought and what the establishment thought.
Yeah, Hoover died overnight at home, suddenly, still as FBI director in May of 1972. And it was a huge national event when that happened because most people alive in the United States at that moment did not remember a time when J. Edgar Hoover was not the head of the FBI. He had been there for 48 years. So it was a big political pageant. It was a national event. His funeral was broadcast live on all 3 television networks. Richard Nixon delivered his eulogy. So it was a big national spectacle. And, because it was the moment of his death, a lot of people were paying tribute to his really monumental career. But at the same time, people were also saying, let's not do that again.
So you write at the very, I think this is maybe your last sentence of your book, you write as follows: we cannot know our own story without understanding his, in all its aspirations and terrible cruelty, and in its human contradictions. Would you elaborate on that?
One of the things that I wanted to do with this book was to take Hoover from being this figure, when you see him in movies, often when you see him in history books, he's sort of sitting alone in a room, scheming and trying to strong arm everyone else into doing what he was doing. And there's some truth to that. But the fact is that J. Edgar Hoover was, for most of his career, the most popular, most widely supported public servant in all of the United States. He stayed on under 8 presidents who kept him there. Congress gave him lots of support. He had a network in the press, all of this. And so I think we're getting away with something, actually, if we say, oh, Hoover was just this rogue figure who strong-armed everyone else into doing things. We made him, right? The United States, the government, American society made him and empowered him and created him. And that is in some ways a really dangerous story and a cautionary tale. In the book, at that point about contradictions, I also tried to make Hoover into a human being and someone who actually did some good things sometimes, but also who had a big set of problems to wrestle with and, wrestled with them as best he could.
Well, thank you. This has all been very interesting. I want to see if we have some questions, and we can see what the information is. So here's a question from Roger Dietz. Does an academic or journalist have the same access to information about the FBI today as you had when you wrote your book?
Well, that's an interesting question. And I don't know because I'm not myself actively trying to get that information at the moment. I mean, we've seen these big disclosures of documents that have come out in the last 3 or 4 months. So in some ways, about certain parts of this history, the current administration seems very determined to get information released. The JFK assassination releases were actually mostly not really about the assassination itself, but were about the much bigger context. So there's lots of interesting stuff in there about the CIA and Cuba, and Latin America, all of this sort of thing. So, that's one piece of what's happening. And we're starting, I think, to see those disclosures with Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, etc. Of course, this doesn't seem like a very promising moment overall for the Freedom of Information Act, which is still the main tool by which most journalists and historians find out things about the FBI. A lot of the historical stuff is just at the National Archives. But the Freedom of Information Act, it's a pretty routine process now. Its main problem is that it just takes a really long time. And so if you're going to defund and take away staffing from things like the National Archives or the FOIA branch of the Bureau, I don't really know what's happening there. You're obviously going to pose a lot of problems for researchers. Last thing I'll say is that the current administration also doesn't seem very committed to keeping its own historical records, right? I mean, signal chats, flushing things down the toilet, these are not things that, well, I would say either citizens, but especially historians should be super enthused about.
So Mark Ratner asked the following question. Please discuss the role of Hoover, the FBI, and the Osage murders discussed in Killers of the Flower Moon.
Yeah, it's a really important early case for the FBI. I didn't write much about it in the book, in part because Hoover himself was not the central figure exactly, and also because there was already a very good book about it, and so I thought that I would write about other things. But it's a very important case for the FBI early on. Because it's really just still figuring out how to do investigative work. And I think, the other thing that is interesting from an institutional perspective is that it's sort of a sign of the strange grab bag of duties that the FBI had then and to some degree still has now. Most law enforcement in the United States is at the state and local level. And so the federal government has this weird array of things that it investigates and has jurisdiction over. That was much stranger in the 1920s, but crimes on federal reservations at the time were something that the FBI had the ability to do, along with interstate prostitution, a little bit of political surveillance, a little bit of auto theft if it crossed state lines. I mean, it's just a very strange array of duties.
Mel Oppenheim asked, what part did racism play in Hoover's animus towards Martin Luther King?
Well, I think it played a big role. So Hoover always resisted pressure, which began in the 1940s, to hire Black agents into his agent corps. There were moments where he had working relationships with organizations like the NAACP for practical purposes in the 40s and 50s and such. But he himself was always a pretty committed segregationist, although he wouldn't have articulated it quite that way. He had deep ties to Southern law enforcement, to Southern Democrats in Congress. King himself, I think, was sort of a perfect storm for Hoover. So he was Black, and Hoover's racism, combined with the broader racism of American society, frankly, meant that Black activists always got among the harshest treatment of anyone who came under the FBI's net. King was also someone who Hoover was very upset about the hypocrisy as he saw it over King's sex life. King had some communists in his orbit, and I think to some degree, most of all, King's strategy as a civil rights movement leader was a strategy of civil disobedience, right? And had a set of very powerful moral claims about laws that you had to obey and laws that you ought to resist. And Hoover was, if nothing else, a true law and order man. And so he was particularly hostile to protest groups and activists who took up those particular forms of protest, which he saw as just nothing more than law breaking. So there were a lot of things that Hoover objected to about Martin Luther King, but certainly racism is a big part of that story.
Jay Fleischman asks, other than anti-communism, did Hoover have strong political beliefs that we could put on a left-right continuum?
Well, Hoover is an interesting character politically. So when I started working on this biography, the main puzzle that I wanted to figure out was that Hoover seemed to represent two political traditions that made sense to him and in his moment, but that we don't see very often in our own politics. So he really was a true believer in professional, nonpartisan career government service as a noble enterprise, right? As the thing that he dedicated his whole life to. He believed in federal power. He believed in the idea that federal power could do good for the ordinary citizen. He was a state builder. He was a bureaucrat. All of these things that we tend to associate with being part of a progressive tradition or a liberal tradition. And in fact, in his career, it really was Lyndon Johnson and Franklin Roosevelt, our big liberal presidents, who gave the FBI and Hoover most of their power. So that's one piece of Hoover. And then on the other hand, he was this total conservative ideologue, not just on anti-communism, but on race and on religion and on law and order. And he described himself as a conservative. Other people described him as a conservative. So he has this funny combination by our lights of factors. The other thing to say about Hoover politically is that he had lots of political relationships with different presidents, with Congress, but he actually was not a partisan figure. He served under 4 Democrats. He served under 4 Republicans. He never voted because he was a resident of Washington, D.C., so he couldn't vote, but he also never did vote. He never joined a political party, and he was very careful about that part of his identity and his career, in part because, he wanted to stay in power as the parties changed.
I think you probably discussed this a little bit, but Bill Siegel asks, your book does not definitely state that Hoover was gay. What do you privately think about that, and how did it affect his directorship?
Well, as a historian, right, I am bound by the evidence, and I am also, so that means both that we don't know what kind of sex he had, if he had sex at all, and that he himself did not describe himself this way. And so there are sort of tricky questions of, is being gay an identity? Is it a set of sexual acts? Is it just an impulse? I mean, these are all actually quite complicated questions. And it wasn't the language of that moment. And so it is true in the book, I avoided, I kind of stayed with that, which I think was the right approach. I mean, I think that yes, in a colloquial sense, I think Hoover was gay. I mean, he never dated a single woman in any credible way. He and Tolson had such an intimate relationship with each other. But exactly what that means, were they having sex? Did he think about himself this way? That's a different set of things. And in terms of the Bureau, Well, I think, one of the things that, one of the ways it affected the Bureau was that it made Clyde Tolson the associate director for all that time. I think, Hoover also was charged with investigating homosexuals within the federal government who that was against civil service policy and against the law in that sense in the 40s and 50s. And so that's a very complicated story as well. But in terms of the rumors about his own sexuality, he actually would send, if he heard that someone at some dinner party or social event said, I hear that the director of the FBI is queer, he would actually send agents to your door to say, J. Edgar Hoover is the finest, most manly, most upstanding American that you've ever seen. So there was also a really direct impact in that sense as well.
And it was sort of a threat to these people. You don't want to be saying this again.
Right.
So welched whatever rumors came about. I was going to get to this, and so Richard Marsh helps me with this. How did the powers of Kash Patel compare to those wielded by Hoover? Specifically, does Patel have any more constraints as Hoover?
Well, it's a great question, and it's an important question right now. In the 1970s, in the late 60s and 70s, there were a set of constraints put in place on the FBI, partly to sort of ensure that you weren't going to get another J. Edgar Hoover again. And so Hoover's legacy had an impact then. So some of those were, as Michael said, this creation of a 10-year limit for the FBI director. That was to not have someone there for 48 years. You got expansions of the Freedom of Information Act. The Congressional Intelligence Committees came into being in the 1970s as well. And internal to the Bureau and to the Justice Department, there were a whole new set of guidelines that were put in place in the 1970s, many of which have remained in place to this day. Things like, if you're trying to surveil a member of the press, be careful, right? That's a higher level of scrutiny, things like that. So Kash Patel, I would say, is a very, very different creature than J. Edgar Hoover in the sense that he is highly partisan. He is loyal to Donald Trump in a way that Hoover really tried throughout his career to present himself as separate from that kind of partisan politics. Patel said pretty openly before he became FBI director that he wanted to use the Bureau as a force of political vengeance. So that's something that, J. Edgar Hoover might have some interest and sympathy for, though he would have probably not been quite so open about it. And I think right now we're still waiting to see. There have been purges of top officials that Patel did not like. There's been a Bureau reorganization underway. I think that the big questions to me are, number one, what's going to happen on the intelligence side of the FBI, which is where most of the abuses have often happened, which is to say, if you have to make a court case, right, you got all sorts of, at least in theory until now, you had all sorts of due process and things that you were supposed to follow, whereas intelligence is a much more nebulous realm. And so therefore a very powerful tool. And then a lot of what has constrained the FBI in the post-Hoover era have been these internal guidelines and not other things. And so those guidelines can be changed pretty easily.
So we know that Robert Caro is working on another book, and he's not revealing how he's doing. But the question from Carolyn Setlow is, would you be willing to tell us about the book of books you are currently working on and how you select your topics?
Yeah, I would love to. So I am finishing up a book that is geared to 2026, which is going to be the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. It has changed a little bit since the title that Michael read out. It's called This Land is Your Land, a road trip through US history. And that is a book in which I have been traveling the country, going to historic sites, and really narrating American history in a way that lots of people can approach and understand, as, you know, a way to think about whether you want to celebrate or condemn or both your country and its history as we approach the 250th. So I'm very excited about this book. It's been lots of fun. It's partly a personal narrative, but mostly it is an attempt to get from 1776 to now through these 13 different places that I went to visit, and to write about. Each chapter of the book is both a place and a moment in time. So I start out in my hometown of Philadelphia, and it ends up in California, but in between it goes all over the place. I have a chapter on Montana and the Dakotas in the late 19th century. You know, a chapter on Detroit in the 1920s and 30s. So I think it's got some hard history in it, but it's fun and I hope exciting and useful for people in this moment where I'm not sure we're going to get a lot of great official history coming out for the 250th. So that's what I'm finishing up now. And then I'm going to turn to writing a biography of Ronald Reagan. And Reagan is, to me, a little bit of a sequel to Hoover in the sense that one of the questions about the 20th century that I am the most interested in is how the politics of communism and anti-communism really structured American history for that whole century in a way that came to an end, right? We have resonance of it now, but it's not the same thing. And Hoover got me to the 1970s in that story. Reagan has a similarly sweeping career over a vast period of time, and he can get me to the end of the Cold War as well.
Well, both books sound wonderful and interesting. However, we know that to write a biography takes many, many years. So I was thinking we'll have you back soon, but it won't be soon.
It won't be soon, and that's actually one of the reasons that I wanted to write This Land is Your Land. I wanted to write a short book. I wanted to write a book that got me away from just sitting with archives all the time. But yeah, I suspect the Reagan book, like the Hoover book, will take something like a decade.
So Pamela Goldberg asked this, could you discuss the role of the FBI in the Charlie Manson in family investigation and prosecution?
You know, that's interesting. I don't know very much about that. My sense is that the Bureau didn't necessarily play a big role in that. I could be wrong about it. I don't, as I said, I don't know the case that well, but I think it was really a local case. And so, you know, the FBI might have contributed information, but my understanding is that it was not necessarily a federal case and would have been investigated by the California authorities.
Okay, so Bernie Belkin says, have you done research on the FBI since Hoover's death? And if so, do you think the rank and file FBI agents are reacting to how they are reacting to the Trump administration and the leadership of the FBI?
You know, I really don't have any particular access to or insight into the inner workings of the FBI at the moment. You know, my research really stopped in the 70s. I, of course, have talked with lots of FBI agents and officials over the years, but I don't have any inside track into what's going on.
I was we didn't get to this. Hoover had a personal file that he kept of, I guess, his own little letters and so forth. And what happened to that personal file at his death?
His secretary, Helen Gandy, who had worked with him for about 50 years, she destroyed it at his request. And so that's been one of the big questions of of the post-Hoover years is what was actually in that file. Helen Gandy said it was mostly like birthday cards and personal letters. There's some evidence that there were some other things in there too. That was destroyed. His official and confidential file, which was in his office, was preserved. And that's where we have some of what we know about Martin Luther King or John Kennedy. That was reserved for sort of high profile cases and kept in Hoover's office.
Here we have a question from Joel Schwartz. In Hoover's later years at FBI, did he feel that the FBI and the CIA have conflicts when it comes to domestic crimes?
They had a terrible relationship. They were real rivals, partly because Hoover was upset in the 1940s at the creation of the CIA, partly because I think Hoover somewhat rightly viewed the CIA as a lawless organization, a bunch of playboys doing these secret operations that weren't always a very good idea. There was also a real culture clash between the two of them. And so the FBI agents were a little more, they were college graduates, but they were a little more working class, middle class, whereas the CIA tended to be these kind of, striped pants, Ivy League fellows. So there were lots of points of conflict. I mean, in terms of the domestic US, the CIA is not supposed to be doing anything domestically in the United States. And when they violated that, the FBI got pretty upset. There are various moments when investigations, jurisdiction isn't really clear, particularly in espionage. And then in the late 60s and early 70s, they got into some conflicts about, whose job it was to surveil the anti-war movement. Was that international? Was that domestic? So they fought a lot.
Well, now we come to the end of our Fridays at 1, and I really appreciated your helping us out, and I think everybody learned a lot, and we thank you for coming today. I hope everybody agrees that this was a most stimulating conversation. Today was our final Fridays at 1 program for this semester. The committee is currently lining up an exciting list of speakers in the fall, so stay tuned. We hope you will join us again in September. Have a nice weekend, and thank you so much, Professor Gage.
All right, thanks.